Welcome back to Faith on Film, where we raid your church library in search of the good stuff. I'm Nathan.
And I'm Stephanie. Hey, look, it's time for another Jesus movie Lent. What's on the docket this year? Better be good.
Have you heard of King of Kings?
That's not the one where the only good scene is the resurrection of Lazarus, is it?
That's the greatest story ever told.
Uh-oh.
No, this one stars the captain from Star Trek as Jesus.
Ooh, William Shatner?
No, Captain Pike.
Bruce Greenwood, Anson Mount?
Original Captain Pike.
Yes, Jeffrey Hunter from the first unaired pilot of Star Trek is our Jesus, which prompted a lot of jokes about being a teenage Jesus due to Hunter's very young appearance, even though he actually was in his early 30s at the time. This also prompted even more jokes about how good-looking he was for the part, seeing as Hunter had to literally wax his chest for the crucifixion scene, so the audience wouldn't be distracted.
Which is 100% why we're covering it for Heartthrob Jesus Lent. Yes, there's something of a tendency to make Jesus hot, which is not necessarily wrong, but it is weird. Like, there's nothing about this character that says, "For God so loved the world that he made his only begotten son eye candy."
Ah, but he had no stately form or majesty to attract us, no beauty that we should desire him.
Okay, yes, but reading Isaiah 53 super literally as a prophecy about Jesus and only Jesus has never gotten us anywhere, so besides, it's Hollywood.
Touché. This particular Lord Who's a Looker comes to us from director Nicholas Ray. One of the original writers for this project, John Farrow, left the project, at the time called Son of Man, because he wanted to use lines exclusively from the Bible for the script, and the producer, Samuel Bronston, said that that would make it unfilmable.
Amateurs. With that background in mind, let's take a look at King of Kings. The 1960s one. We need new editors.
Let's dig out our trusty Jesus movie checklist and start off once again with the Exposition. This movie begins, as all Jesus movies do, with the military campaigns of Pompey the Great. That doesn't sound right.
Rossellini opened with a kid taking a leak in the desert before getting killed by a Philistine. I refuse to believe that this is weirder.
This movie puts a lot of emphasis on Rome's occupation of Judea, which isn't necessarily a bad way to go, but I feel like there could be more expedient ways to convey this information than a narrator talking over Pompey entering the temple while simultaneously informing us that no pagan has ever dared to step foot inside the temple. That doesn't sound right either.
Not long after that, the king sent an elderly Athenian to force the Jews to abandon their religion and the customs of their ancestors. He was also to defile their temple by dedicating it to the Olympian god Zeus. 2 Maccabees 6.
Well, that's just embarrassing. Seriously, you guys have heard of Hanukkah, right?
This narrator seems to speak exclusively in prose written to sound like the King James Version, without ever once actually quoting the Bible. It's also especially embarrassing that he's pronouncing people's names differently than everyone else in the cast. For instance, everybody else calls the guy Barabbas, and the narrator's off here going, Barabbas? Who is this lifeless narrator anyway?
Orson Welles.
You're kidding me.
The man was known for phoning it in when he didn't care. Oh, and also, sci-fi legend Ray Bradbury wrote all of Wells's lines.
Wells feeds us into Herod the Great being established as the king of Judea by the Romans, queuing up that massacre of the innocents thing. Again, it seems like there were better ways to get us to this point without eating up all this screen time, but I guess historical context isn't so bad.
What is pretty bad is the Magi showing up without stopping at Herod's first to ask for directions, and Herod somehow still knows about the birth of Jesus anyway. At least Jesus of Nazareth made it a point to have Herod spying on the wise men. This just feels like we're missing a scene.
The elder Herod dies and is then replaced by his son Herod Antipas. This is a surprisingly good scene where Antipas plops himself down on the throne and kicks his dying father over. This is also the last time Antipas will be used effectively in the entire movie.
At least they got one good scene. A shocking amount of screen time is eaten up by this depiction of Herod. And what's even more unusual is a good bulk of the screen time shows him hanging out with Pontius Pilate. I mean it. These guys are practically never seen apart. These guys go to the sauna together, Pilate comes to Herod's birthday party, they listen to the daily reports together, they're like BFFs. Which is really funny because I was under the impression that they were political rivals, but whatever.
Herod's stepdaughter / niece Salome is also given a fair amount of prominence. For the first half of the movie, anyway. Once she does her infamous dance, she all but disappears. And she's also one of the few actors to try. I'm not going to claim she's amazing as an actress. She's fine. But when she's surrounded by everyone else giving these lifeless performances, any amount of oomph is going to look amazing. My speculation is that everyone else was treating this as a divine project, so they had to project a certain detachment from real life. Whereas Bridget Baslin was hired for the sexy dancing and thus felt freer to be a person.
It is well documented that biblical epics were a very popular genre back in the day because it was easier to skirt around the Haze Code. Basically, you could show people sinning if they were biblical characters and were probably going to be punished anyway. So while we don't have any hard evidence on this, it's not too hard to imagine that the reason Salome gets so many scenes is because they could get away with having this gorgeous young woman moving her body. Keep in mind that Maslin herself was 17 at the time, which is a little yeesh.
Ew.
But hey, no navel.
Of particular note plot-wise is that while Salome does ask for John the Baptist's head, this time she comes up with it pretty much on her own. She's doing it on Herodias' behalf, but Herodias herself is more window dressing. She's there, but doesn't really do anything.
There are a lot of people in this movie who don't really do anything. Like Caiaphas. There's this recurring problem in this movie where characters will have all of these scenes, but never actually act out the scene that they're known for. Caiaphas is a perfect example. We have all of these scenes where he is also hanging out with Herod Antipas and Pontius Pilate, but he never actually manages to get around to sharing a scene with Jesus. So there's no trial before the priest, there's no better for one man to die, nothing.
I'm particularly amused by a bit where he tries to throw shade at Herod by saying he's appointed by Rome. You're also appointed by Rome, you hypocrite!
Oh, and here's another one. Caiaphas has this one scene where he's walking with Nicodemus. This is the only time we're going to see Nicodemus, by the way. He's not going to go to Jesus by night, or help bury him, or anything, so I gotta ask, why did we even bother with this cameo?
Pilate's wife Claudia also falls victim to this. She's introduced pretty early on, even before adult Jesus enters the scene, so you would think she's going to play some big role. Well, about that. She attends the Sermon on the Mount, but there's never even a mention of her dream warning Pilate not to sentence Jesus. So, why? My best guess is that she's here just to facilitate Lucius's arc.
Who?
Our maybe sorta main character.
Okay.
I say that because his is the only arc that runs the entire span of the movie. He's the centurion placed in charge of the massacre of the innocents. Not sure that Herod the Great was given Roman soldiers, but okay. Then he goes around 12 years later checking census records and wonders why Mary and Joseph didn't register their son.
And adding Joseph to the list of characters who are in this movie and do everything except for what they're known for?
When they mention that he was born in Bethlehem, he's all mystified that any child could have survived, but refuses to investigate it any further.
He's bad at his job. He has a lot of random jobs in this movie. First, he's working for Herod the Great and Herod Antipas. Okay, fine. But then he's also working for Pilate, and sometimes he's the baby executioner, but then sometimes he's John the Baptist's prison guard, but then sometimes he's Pilate's wife's personal attendant, but then sometimes he's a detective investigating Barabbas' zealot cell, and then sometimes he's the defense attorney. He's basically literally wherever the story needs him to be.
He wears a lot of hats.
Yes, he does.
Hold up. Back up. What was that you said about a defense attorney?
Oh, right. Pilate gets really frustrated when Jesus isn't answering any questions at his trial, so Lucius steps in as sort of a defense attorney, and he attempts to argue Jesus' charges down to tax evasion.
So Jesus is Al Capone.
Apparently.
Who reads the Gospels and goes, man, this Jesus fella, he really needed a lawyer. That would have fixed everything.
What's funny is, it ends up in the same place anyway, so why did we bother?
Lucius is also somewhat inevitably, I suppose, the centurion at the foot of the cross. So Lucius is Pilate's prison guard? Did he just look at Lucius's resume and go, oh, I see you have prison guard experience, and we'll just put you there this shift? And Lucius was like, oh, well, you're sure you don't need me at that execution later today? And Pilate was like, okay, you can pick up that shift too. He says, surely this man was the Christ. The line is Son of God. That's what would have been shocking to hear a Roman troop say. If you want to follow Luke's track and have him say a righteous man, okay, fine, whatever. But this is just nothing. At least John Wayne got the words right.
Yeah, semantics.
I refuse to believe that that's just a pointless detail.
Yes, but if you pointed this out to the screenwriters, I'm pretty sure that's exactly what they'd tell you.
Let's talk about John the Baptist.
Well, gee, don't sound too excited.
I cannot muster any enthusiasm for this John. He's so dull. It's like he just took some sleeping pills and is waiting for them to kick in the entire time he's on screen. What's especially jarring is everyone else talks about him like he's this rousing, dynamic figure. Barabbas wants to tap him to rouse up the people of Judea to join the Zealots. Herod and Pilate are afraid, well, they say they're afraid, but they're immensely calm about the whole thing, that he'll sick a mob to storm the temple. This guy? This guy? Seriously? The only thing he's inspiring people to do is go home and do anything else.
They also attempt to tie in John's arrest with an incident that Josephus recorded about Pilate putting up an image of Caesar in the temple and the Jewish population being very upset about it. But Josephus does reference John the Baptist in entirely different contexts, so whatever. It's just really bizarre seeing this character who is known as a voice crying in the wilderness, spending all of this time in the city.
They also rest really heavily on Herod thinking that Jesus is John come back from the dead, which is something that happens in the Gospels and rarely makes it to film. But they do it so sloppily.
Of course they do.
Because Herod is well aware of Jesus and his wheelings and dealings before John is ever executed. Shouldn't you know that the guy you have locked up in here is not that guy out there?
You'd think.
Jesus even comes to visit John in prison.
This is a nice scene. It's not a good scene, but it's nice. I think it would have carried a bit more weight if these two characters had actually exchanged dialogue before this point, or say maybe you establish them as cousins, or say you make Jesus visiting John in prison the payoff to John sending a disciple to ask Jesus, is he the Messiah, or should we wait for someone else like he does in Matthew's Gospel? Funnily enough, that scene does appear later in this movie, but its resolution really feels kind of botched when the solution is Jesus' voice just carried in the wind to John right before he gets executed.
I will note, however, that Jesus' response gets mangled in the screenwriting process. He's supposed to say to the people who happen to be present, "What did you go out into the wilderness to see about John?" But now he's saying that directly to John about himself. That's not how this works.
John doesn't even say to Jesus, "It is I who should be baptized by you." He baptizes Jesus and then he goes and asks Mary, all the way over in Nazareth, why Jesus came to be baptized by him. That's just really strange because Nazareth and the Jordan River aren't close to each other. But what's even funnier is you could have just asked Jesus that like you do in the Gospels.
Mary's role in this movie is probably the best example of doing everything except what you're supposed to do. There is no Annunciation. There is no wedding at Cana. There is no "Who are my mother and my brothers?" I swear, it's like not a single scene of hers comes from the text except the actual birth.
We do get "Lo and behold your son."
Okay, two. She spends most of her time just hanging out, saying vaguely profound-sounding things about her son. Would anybody like some bread?
My son is the bread of life.
Could we have one day, where we talk like a normal family, please?
My son will one day... Mary barely spends any screen time with Jesus at all, by the way. So there really isn't any sense of a mother and son bond, but we'll correct that next time.
She does, however, have a scene with Mary Magdalene. We think. That's another thing. Characters are not introduced well in this movie. Herod, early on, has some really on-the-nose lines, like addressing Salome directly as "my stepdaughter." But then, after a while, the characters just don't get introduced. Ever. How do you fail at the same thing in two completely opposite directions?
No, seriously. Mary Magdalene is never directly addressed by name. We're just guessing that it's her because she's in the pericope adulterae scene and later shows up on Easter Sunday. And that's basically it. She has no scenes in between except for this one with Mary. Her only line is to Mary, and she keeps going on and on about what a horrible person she is instead of, actually having any type of personality. Seriously, she's basically a face in the crowd in a Where's Waldo sort of way.
Dave, wouldn't it be embarrassing if those two women were actually completely different actresses?
Yes, but would you be surprised?
No. On to Judas. Judas and Barabbas are portrayed as best buds in this movie, which is not in the Bible, but I see how we got here. Barabbas' actions are typically understood as those of a zealot, the sect of Second Temple Judaism which sought to liberate the Holy Land by force. Judas' surname Iscariot is sometimes interpreted as derived from Sicarii, which was a subgroup of zealots which were known for their stealthy assassinations. There are problems with that reading, namely that the Sicarii themselves didn't really develop until a couple decades later, but it is a popular enough characterization that we're going to see it pop up a couple more times.
We already have. What's really strange about this movie's depiction of Barabbas is he's kind of played up as public enemy number one. I mean, look at this. All throughout the movie, the Romans are looking for him. He has thousands of followers, which he is really well organized into these sects of really effective guerrilla warfare. You're honestly telling me that Pilate is even going to consider putting this guy up against Jesus when it comes time to asking the people who they want freed? I don't buy it.
Barabbas is consistently framed as the anti-Jesus.
Why not just say anti-Christ?
Because the audience will think I mean something else.
Touché.
No. He's the counterpoint to Jesus' more peaceful methods, where Barabbas constantly wants freedom by the sword. Jesus is played up as being, well, they want me to say pacifistic, but I would sooner characterize it as abject passivity. We'll get there. There's even a scene where Judas is conflicted about which of the men he wants to go with, and Orson Welles characterizes this as being torn between the Messiah of war and the new Messiah of peace. Excuse me? Barabbas has made no messianic claims. In fact, he's looking for the Messiah elsewhere so he can join forces with him.
Only the true Messiah denies his divinity. What?
Judas is once again let down by Jesus' complete lack of interest in fighting. But he never actually asks Jesus about it. What is it with this movie and its inability to have characters actually share a scene with Jesus? Seriously! Anyway, he goes off behind everybody's backs to betray Jesus, and that apparently includes the audience because we don't see it either. Orson Welles informs us that he is trying to force Jesus' hand, because we couldn't convey this with any actual lines.
Lucius, who is now one of Pilate's jailers, goes to Barabbas to inform him he's been set free.
Oh, hold on. Give us Barabbas happened off screen too?
Yeah.
How is it that all of the important scenes in this movie happen when we're not looking? I can't believe I'm saying this, but this biblical epic needs more Bible scenes in it.
Oh, you're not gonna like the apostles, then.
What do?
Nothing!
Of course not. Why would they?
Andrew is this weird tag-along who goes with John to visit Mary. He doesn't do or say anything or is ever introduced. He's just John's sidekick. And the rest of them aren't really any kind of presence until an hour and 39 minutes into the movie. An hour and 39 minutes. And even then, it's only because they want to show the disciples being sent off 2 by 2. But you've had most of these guys for 10 minutes, Jesus. You want to give them a little more training?
Of particular note is, even though the Zealots are so dang important to this movie, Simon the Zealot is misidentified as Simon the Canaanite. Swing and a miss.
This lack of involvement from the apostles really kicks in when Peter goes to tell people that he doesn't know Jesus. We couldn't think of a reason that they wouldn't believe him. That's how little he's been seen with Jesus. And this is Peter, the apostle who canonically has the most lines and the most development.
Sounds like we're finally on Jesus. Right off the bat, this movie lets you know that Jesus isn't going to be the biggest part of this movie, as Jeffrey Hunter is listed as a co-star. Well, that's promising.
Jesus doesn't do much.
Of course not.
Oh, they talk about him doing a lot. Lucius reads off report after report of Jesus doing miraculous what-have-yous. But for being the first big budget movie to show Jesus' face in decades, he doesn't do a lot when he's on screen. He's terribly inactive. There are a few miracles shown early on, but they're so brief and inconsequential that they're quickly forgotten. And they're very poorly set up, too. Like, is this kid paralyzed? Dead? What's actually happening here?
I have no idea. Jesus is effectively a drive-by healer. I wish I could say that they make up for this by really focusing on Jesus' teachings, sort of like Il Messiah did. But no such luck. We get the Sermon on the Mount and the Pericope Adulterae, but on the whole, we don't really ever get to see Jeffrey Hunter really take a crack at, say, any of the parables. We have somebody directly ask Jesus about why does he hang out with sinners, but funnily enough, we don't actually see him hang out with any sinners.
I would argue that even the few teachings that do get in are pretty neutered. Like, when Lucius tells Pilate what he heard at the Sermon on the Mount, he sums it up as peace, love, and the brotherhood of man.
Philosophy of total love and total brotherhood.
Aha! Right. Because there would be nothing controversial whatsoever about saying the kingdom of God belongs to the poor, or that those who serve money are against God. Okay, not Jesus' most impactful sayings, but that's kinda my point. Jesus is taken from boldly speaking truth to power to saying very little of any actual consequence. Just general niceties remain.
Oh, look, it's the gospel according to Hallmark again.
Easily the biggest misstep in this regard is when Jesus goes to Jerusalem. Barabbas stirs up a huge, and I mean huge, riot in the streets, hoping that Jesus' followers will join with his in the heat of the moment, while Jesus is in the temple. Now, when Jesus goes into the temple in the week leading up to his execution, what do you think of?
Is a house of prayer!
He's a fool! We must stone him to death!
And you have turned it into a den of thieves!
Yeah, that scene never happens. We are told that all Jesus ever did in the temple was pray quietly. Jesus disrupting the day-to-day operations is basically a foretaste of the very destruction of the temple that he prophesied at the time. He's denouncing the manipulation of people's faith while directly invoking earlier prophets like Jeremiah. And as Nathan already said, Caiaphas was directly chosen by Rome. So if the temple run by him is against God, what does that say about the empire? This is Jesus at his most active in living out the reign of God, because God will not stand idly by while people are exploited, especially if that's being done in his own name.
Jesus is played so aggressively safe that it feels like Pilate and friends just go after him because he has such a big following that he could maybe hypothetically pose a threat to them if he wanted to, that they'd rather focus on him than the actual threat to them whom they release from prison. Pilate argues that preaching a kingdom of God is preaching against Rome, and Lucius tries to argue against this. Okay, the movie wants to frame Lucius as the correct party here, but that's actually Pilate. That's what they should have been focusing on this entire time. This movie is sometimes pejoratively called Rebel Without a Clue. Get it? But that's deeply ironic because this is one of the least rebellious Jesus I've ever seen.
As it is, the idea of Jesus being the king really doesn't factor into this movie much at all, which is deeply ironic given the title. Considering that this movie is much more interested in Jesus, the ultimate pacifist, wouldn't the Prince of Peace have been a more apt title for this epic? It would have at least made a little bit more sense.
Jesus' crucifixion also feels bizarrely rushed. Technically, there is a fade from Judas to maybe Magdalene to imply the passage of time, but it's real easy to miss. So it winds up feeling like he's only up there for 3 minutes and 15 seconds before he dies. I mean, jeez. It felt like Victor Garber was up there longer and he was tied to a chain link fence. Couldn't you have let the sun set a little? It looks like 2 in the afternoon.
Well, the scene with John in prison earlier did demonstrate that this Jesus has no upper body strength.
Gee, Mary, your kid can't carry much wood. Must not be much of a carpenter.
One day, my son will carry the weight of the world
Alright,
on his shoulders.
jeez, I get it!
One thing I will say that I do like about this depiction of Good Friday is the more casual brutality of it all. Such as this flogged man being dragged off as Jesus being taken before Pilate, or Golgotha being covered with crosses, some of which still have corpses on them. Sometimes Jesus movies kind of fall into this trap of going out of their way to show the Romans being extra, especially cruel to Jesus, like more cruel than they are to any of their other prisoners. But it's also just as likely that Jesus' torture was just another day at the office for these guys, and there's something about that that's even more unsettling.
Overall, the set work for this movie is quite impressive, but it's kind of weird seeing all these unmotivated actors in these lavish locations. It comes across like Bronston thought throwing production value at the movie would elevate it. But the end result is something that looks impressive, but only superficially.
The soundtrack is decent. It's not amazing. It's not one of the greatest soundtracks of all time, but it serves its purpose. The music is done by Miklos Rocha, who is the same composer behind Ben-Hur. Oh, come on, the famous one! Thank you.
The editing and cinematography, though, leave something to be desired. We've already talked about how scenes will start without proper setup, but it's also just kind of strange that the camera seems allergic to giving actors close-ups. Would getting close in the frame on their face when they're saying something important kill you? It makes it difficult to feel like anyone is experiencing human emotions when they're constantly held at arm's length from us.
This review was a really long way of saying that the costumes and the set designs were nice, and the music is pretty. That's really all this movie has going for it. You know what I think this movie's main problem is? Well, two things. One, it's really operating under the assumption that the audience is already familiar with the life and teachings of Jesus, which, as you might recall, the best Christmas pageant ever told us to never do. It can't seem to figure out who the main character is. Is it Jesus? The Herods? Lucius? Barabbas?
No, he'll get his own movie. It feels like they had the skeleton of the gospel narratives laid out on a page, and they used that as their outline to insert their own narrative, or maybe that should be narratives. But they never actually went back and fleshed out what is ostensibly the point of the movie. Bible movies embellish all the time. We're used to that, and sometimes it's necessary to get a 3-act structure. But this is one of the rare times where it comes at the expense of the story you're here to tell.
And at 2 hours and 50 minutes, there is no excuse for that. I can see why some fans of the biblical epic genre have a soft spot for this one, but for me, this was just a bad one.
This movie, like many of its ilk, wanted to be the next The Ten Commandments or Ben-Hur. And even the choice of title feels like a callback to DeMille, but there was no creative vision. This feels like a hollow cash grab and not much else.
Can't argue with you there.
Thank you for joining us for Faith on Film. I'm Nathan.
And I'm Stephanie. We'll see you next time.
I think that going to the sauna together is the weirdest one. I suppose
Pilot
it's
and Herod hanging in the sauna.
Oodle alley, golly, what a day.
Oh, brother.
Which one's Little John? I bet it's Herod. It would be Little John.
Yes.
Now I want to watch that movie.
I like it.
It's sneaky, and it
Just
might work! We could use him as a footstool or a table to play Scrabble and then tie him up and beat him up and throw him out of Babylon. Okay, now Jesus' hardest hitting say. Okay, not Jesus' hardest hit is... Why is that phrase so hard to say? Okay, not Jesus' hardest hit is... Good grief!